Hi, my dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Acharei. The laws of kashrut in Leviticus chapter 11 are not the only instance of the Torah restricting meat consumption. There are two additional times in the history of humanity when eating animals was restricted. Firstly, before the Great Flood, all of mankind, there were no Jews back then, were restricted from consuming animals. Only after Noah emerged from the ark did Hashem tell him that from that point forward, he would have full dominion to eat animals in addition to vegetation. Immediately after God told Noah that he could eat animals, he also warned him not to kill human beings. As the commentaries explain, it was necessary to underscore at this point, now, since Noah and his family might have inferred that just as it was now permitted to kill animals, it might be permitted to also kill their fellow human beings. Hashem had to therefore specify that permission to kill was for animals only. But as far as human beings, God said, Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech. He who spills innocent human blood will have his blood in turn spilled by a human, because God created man in his image. Now, that's the first time that meat was restricted from humanity. The second added meat restriction was after the Jews were given the kosher laws. While in the desert and before entering the promised land, there was an additional restriction above and beyond which animals were kosher. The Talmud in Tractate Chulin explains a verse from the book of Devarim that permits us to eat meat whenever we wish. And it explains that the reason why that verse is necessary is because originally, whenever the Jewish people wished to eat meat, they first needed to bring a portion of the animal to the Mishkan as a sacrifice, as a korban. And this is what the Talmud calls bisar ta'ava. That is, meat that is not being brought sacrificially was originally forbidden to the Jews of the desert. According to Rashi on the Talmud, this is also the subject of a commandment in our Parsha Acharei. The Torah tells us that if any Jew wishes to slaughter a cow, a sheep, a goat in the camp, he or she must first bring it to the entrance of the Mishkan. And what if they don't? So the Torah there says, Dam yechashev la'ishahu dam shafach. That person will be considered a bloodshedder, in other words, a murderer, and they will be cut off from their people. Now, why couldn't the Jews of the desert simply shecht a sheep and eat it without bringing it as a korban? Since the Jews had just been plucked from an idolatrous society and animal sacrifice was part of idolatrous worship, Hashem may have wanted to make sure that an Israelite would not sneak off into a dark corner of the desert and offer sacrifices to other deities. This is certainly implicit in our text, which afterwards states that this law ensures that Bnei Israel will no longer make offerings to the Seirim, or demons of the wilderness. But could there be another reason? Let's examine the way the Torah prohibits bisar ta'ava, this non-sacrificial meat. It says that if you do so, if you take an animal and slaughter it for non-sacrificial purposes, you will be considered a murderer. Now, a person who wants to eat a hamburger is called a murderer? That doesn't make sense. Why be so harsh? Rabbeinu Bechaya suggests that once Hashem prohibited animals from being slaughtered outside the Mishkan, the law reverts back to the way it was before the flood, when man was not permitted to eat animals. Just as back then, killing was prohibited with no distinction made between humans and animals, killing an animal in a prohibited fashion places one outside the dispensation that was granted to Noah to kill animals for food. Now, the question still remains, why were the Jews of the desert not granted the same dispensation that Noah was granted? It's altogether possible that in addition to the concern about idolatry, the Torah sought to sensitize the Jewish people to the preciousness of life itself. When we were in Egypt, the Jews saw how Egyptians treated life with such utter disregard. Because they viewed the Jewish slaves as subhuman, they abused and killed them routinely, as witnessed by Paro's command to drown all the Jewish firstborn. According to the Midrash, Egyptian taskmasters would even take babies and use them as bricks whenever there was a shortfall in the brick quota. Seeing human life treated with such disposability may have required the Jews to undergo a sensitization process. All life, even animal life, has sanctity. Life can only be taken after showing great respect to the animal by sanctifying it to Hashem before consuming it. Once that initial generation of Jews had been sensitized, however, it was no longer necessary to restrict subsequent generations from Bisar Ta'ava because they were not witness to all of that Egyptian cruelty. Now, if we are correct, then we can appreciate why the Torah dispenses a quid pro quo admonition. If you spill blood recklessly without sensitivity to the preciousness of life, then your life will be treated with the same disregard. This admonition appears in other places in the Torah in addition to just our Parsha, including when discussing how Eretz Yisrael cannot tolerate the wanton shedding of blood. In explaining how the Jewish leaders must eliminate murderers from society, the Torah states in the book of Numbers, "V'la'aretz lo yichupar ladam asher shupach ba ki im bedam shofcho." The land of Israel itself will not be atoned for all of the blood that it has absorbed, except by the blood of the spiller. In fact, the only reason why it is justifiable to mete out capital punishment in Jewish law, which is itself a shedding of blood, is because this will ultimately result in less bloodshed, in that murderers will be disincentivized from committing violent crime. Only when man has respect for the sanctity of life can he be allowed to shed blood in a very limited way. Not consuming an animal's blood, which is also in our Parsha, may be another example of commandments that are designed to sensitize the individual to the sanctity of all life, since the blood contains the life force. This may explain an unusual verbiage in the story of Yosef and his brothers. When the brothers saw Yosef approaching in the field, they conspired to put him to death. Reuven, hearing their plan, stated, "Lo nakenu nafesh, let us not smite a soul." But the very next words are, "Vayomer alehem Reuven al tishbechu dam." Reuven said to them, "Do not spill blood, but instead throw him in the pit." The question that is that if Reuven was already speaking to the brothers in the previous verse, why does the Torah have to repeat the words Vayomer alehem Reuven? He said to them. The implication is that even after Reuven told them not to kill Yosef, the brothers didn't agree. They felt justified in putting him to death because they felt that Yosef had committed a capital offense, which is discussed by the commentaries. So Reuven had to change tactics and use a different line of argumentation. That's the reason why it says Vayomer a second time. He told them, even if you're convinced that killing him is correct, it would still be wrong for you to proactively shed his blood because you would thereby turn yourselves into desensitized murderers. Bloodshed begets bloodshed and violence begets violence. Don't be part of that cycle. You are the holy sons of Yaakov. Even if you are justified in eliminating someone from your midst, you should not sully your hands or your psyche by acting violently. You know, we have seen how throughout human history, blood begets blood. This is why Hillel, upon seeing a skull flowing down the river, proclaimed in Pirkei Avot, Al da'atfat atfuch v'sof matifayach yutufun. Because you have shed blood, others shed your blood, and their blood will eventually be shed. He was describing this vicious cycle of violence which only begets more violence. We have just commemorated Yom HaShoah, and we are sadly seeing the cycle of violence continue in Ukraine at the hands of a violent and merciless Russia. A few individuals mentioned to me something that I find to be so far from the truth. Maybe, the argument goes, the Ukrainians have it coming because of all the violence that they perpetrated against the Jews for centuries, including during the Shoah. But despite the fact that it's true that many Ukrainians were very cruel to Jews, this is a terrible mistake in thinking. Besides the fact that many Ukrainians did come to Jews' aid during the Shoah, can you imagine a non-Jew seeing Jews being persecuted, making a similar argument about the Jews, that they might deserve some kind of punishment because of their prior sins? No, my friends, we cannot possibly buy into that kind of thinking. To use the language of the Talmud, Bahadei kavashe derachmano lamalach, what is it your business to take up God's secret reckoning? God may have his own mysterious reasons for allowing violence to be unleashed upon the people of Ukraine, but that's God's business, not ours. Our job is to preserve our humanity and do what human beings are called upon to do. Be compassionate, hold dear the value of all human life, save those lives, and help those in their time of need and despair. If we do any less, then we too will be condemned to that same vicious cycle of blood begetting blood. May our efforts to be sensitive to all life, dear friends, especially human life, bring us to the ultimate redemption, when all swords will be beaten into plowshares. May we see it b'mehera b'yameinu, amen. And may this be the last Yom HaShoah that is sad. May we see a redemption. May we see world peace. And may we to all hatred in the world. Shabbat shalom, dear friends.